Hello and welcome to this episode of Futures, the podcast series brought to you by CIPS, the Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply. Hello, it's me, Emma Scott, and welcome to an International Women's Day special of this CIPS Futures podcast, where we've got not one, but two fabulous guests. First up, we'll hear from Lauren Feery, Group Procurement Director at multinational packaging company DS Smith. And in the second half, we'll hear from ex-Chief Procurement Officer and current CIPS trustee, Juliet Sotnick. Juliet is also a leadership and business coach, as well as a non-executive director. Both have fantastic insights to share. So let's get going, shall we? Hi, Lauren. Welcome to the pod. Great to have you on.
Hi, Emma. Delighted to be here. Thank you very much.
Do you want to just introduce yourself, Lauren, and tell us a little bit about your role, maybe how you got into procurement?
Sure. So look, I'm Group Procurement Director at DS Smith, a global leader in sustainable packaging solutions. We're actually now part of the International Paper Group, which is really exciting for our business. My team services 30 countries. We procure everything from energy, logistics, manufacturing categories to support our packaging and paper mills, and also everyday goods and services for this incredible brand. And people may or may not be as familiar with our brand, but you will have our products in our household. I would bet your bottom dollar. I think for me, I found my way into procurement. Like many people, I don't know that it was a completely conscious choice, Emma. I actually started in commercial sales in telecommunications in Sydney in Australia. And I got so passionate about doing bids and tenders for some of the largest manufacturing commercial clients for that telco. And I got lots involved in bids and tender responses that actually flipped over to the other side and ended up in procurement, which is very much where I've stayed across my career and have just absolutely loved the diversity that's brought to me, and also all the way to London.
You've now been a director or head of procurement and supply chain at a few different organisations. But what's your journey been like to get there? What are those lessons that you've learned along the way that have helped you climb the ladder, so to speak?
I think the first piece is I really am guided by doing what's right by the business always. And I say business, Emma, because I've never worked in public sector. I've always been in private sector, mainly in large or multinational businesses. And I found that in times where I've had to make a decision that might be over my own individual status or role or company silo or function, I'm always guided by what's right for the business, and it's never really led me in a wrong place. And what it has meant that sometimes it's led me to really uncomfortable places where I've had to make tough decisions, but I've never made any decision I've regretted in terms of being guided by what's best for the business. And I think early in my career, I took inspiration from a very seasoned telecommunication executive in Australia. And he'd been in the sector 30 years. And I said to him, what motivates you every day? Every day you read my business cases for procurement and you always ask questions and you're always present in meetings. And he said, he doesn't rubber stamp decisions. He always treats the company funds as his own. And it's something I really took inspiration from, because this person had evolved, and successfully had a 30-year career, same company, but was always guided by doing the right thing. And that's how I think I've learned to evolve my career, always do the right thing. But it has earned me trust from stakeholders because they can see that there's an authenticity in the decisions I make, and I'm guided by doing the right thing. It hasn't always been comfortable. There's been some very uncomfortable times where I've had to make some very tough decisions, but it's always been in the best interest of the long-term or the short-term goals of the business and the stakeholders involved or shareholders.
Doing the right thing isn't always the most popular thing, is it? So, that it often puts you in a tricky position.
Yeah, I think I've seen people come unstuck because if they're overtly political and if they're really just driven by their own individual means or goals, I think it doesn't necessarily inspire the best in others. And I think it's a very thin veneer that others can see. So I think I do bring that authenticity, and people can see that the decisions I make, well, I hope they see that, are always in the best interest of the organisation or the business or the right goals at the right time. In procurement, there's a number of examples where, we're faced with different ethical situations or speak up type situations, particularly, I mean, I've worked across different markets, Asia Pacific, Latin America, Europe, North America, and different sectors where you've got high risk of different types of fraud, perhaps corruption type activity. It does sometimes come up in procurement areas, but I think always just not sitting idle, just doing the right thing, speaking up when you need to speak up. It's been always something I've managed to do, and it helps me sleep well at night. I've got a clear conscience, but I think it's just something I took early in my career from this very senior leader that really inspired me in my career. I think the other piece for me, Emma, as well, is I'm naturally very curious. I love variety. You can probably see from my career, I've been in, I'm quite an interesting fish. I've been in banking and finance, I've been in telco, I've been in oil and gas in British Petroleum, which brought me to London. Also spirit alcohol in FMCG in my last position in Diageo before joining this wonderful business in DS Smith. But I think what's guided that is I'm very externally curious, and I do like variety. But I like to think I take all those different industries and the learnings, and I try to always bring the best of those learnings into the organisations I join. And I use some examples because if I think about oil and gas, I learned a lot about safety. I learned a lot about risk management. If I look at the time I spent in banking and finance and somewhat telecommunications, I learned a lot about very large outsourcing deals, about different commercial constructs for very large IT providers and offshoring, insourcing, etc. And then banking and finance, I learned a lot about regulation and different markets that then helped with everything from GDPR deployments or other things like that. So I think no matter what sector I've been in or different markets and geographies, I like to think I bring the best in.
Moving on to kind of what we're going to talk about today, celebrating International Women's Day. Where do you think we are in terms of gender diversity and inclusion in the procurement profession? Do you think we're heading towards achieving equality of opportunity, or is there still a lot to do? So share some of maybe your own experiences as well as where you think we're going.
It's a very hot topic at the moment. Every day I look at different media articles, and a lot of companies are making quite public statements around how they may be evolving or changing their commitments around not just gender diversity, but other types of D&I. And we all have our different views on that, and there's a lot of politics involved in that, especially if you look at what's happening in America right now. I think the world is changing, and I think that's quite a challenge for many businesses and organisations. What I would say is that I think organisations that I've been part of that do focus on topics of gender diversity, ethnic diversity, looking at diverse candidates in terms of skills, backgrounds, locations, it absolutely does bring better business outcomes. And to me, I find tremendous energy from that. If I think about my time in FMCG, I hired global roles in Uruguay. I hired global roles in Bangalore, and many of the team had previously been quite UK centric. So I think just really, when I think about gender diversity or other types of diverse talent, I genuinely believe that talent is everywhere. And I generally, when I look at multinational businesses or the businesses I've looked for, I look at talent everywhere and where I can move work based on the talent and the needs of the business. I would say my particular sector right now, I think FMCG probably has been performing better. Certainly the last business I came from in terms of both gender and ethnic diversity in quite senior leadership roles. I think manufacturing naturally still does have its challenges in one, attracting talent as a sector. But I have a lot of hope. I think if I think of my business today, I'm so inspired by incredible emerging talent, not just within procurement, but across supply chain, across our packaging and paper mills and corporate head office. There's a lot of talent all through different levels. But I think there's more to do in elevating that to more senior levels. I think the other piece I have learned, Emma, is, and I've been on the other beneficiary of that, is that there has been a war on diverse talent and people have been trying to buy the talent in. I'm a big believer in growing and developing your own so that you're not stealing and begging from others. You're actually growing your own talent. And for me, that looks like, looking for opportunities to mentor diverse talent, again, whether that's gender diversity, it's background, location, skills, etc. But also to look for opportunities even within, leadership teams when you're doing calibrations to really challenge if you don't see diverse talent, whether it's females in the top, the top talent quadrants, asking why and challenging, leadership teams to say in procurement or other sectors, what do we need to do to actually bring more of that talent in, and really shining a light on it. I think that's been quite helpful.
What advice would you give to your younger self, I guess, if you could reflect on maybe some experiences you had as a woman coming through the leadership ranks?
Whew, that's a tough one, because I think I'm by no means perfect. I think as my husband and child, who's now, I shouldn't say child, she's nearly a teenager at nearly 13. I would say sometimes I've not always had the right balance between work and family life. And, if I reflect on my move internationally from Australia, if I look back at my younger self, and this is only when I say younger, going on 8 years ago, I don't think I did the best job in preparing my family for the move, Emma. We had bill shock because I think we had 6 months of rent. I didn't appreciate the cultural shifts between even Australia to the UK. My daughter had a whole new school system. She skipped from nursery right through to year one in skipping preparatory or reception years. So I think what I would say to my younger self is balancing career and family decisions is really tough. And sometimes just taking that extra time to really support your family. I should have done more cultural research. I should have done more school research. I should have done more to prepare my family for that move. I just jumped right in. Now, I would say I'm incredibly fortunate. My husband is the most patient man in the world. And, he quit his job in Australia. He really supported my career move internationally. And he's quite opportunistic and he will take risks. But I just don't think I necessarily prepared my family well for the move. And it probably took us a good 12 to 18 months to adjust. So I have learned to, before I just jump right in and make a career decision, I've learned more to reflect on the implications for my family. For me at this point in my career, my daughter's, very settled in the school system, and I'd think very carefully about sort of making any big changes that may result in different implications for my family.
No, I can completely empathise with that. And I kind of, I hope that female leaders today, regardless of what their external commitments are outside of their job, feel that they can strike a balance. I definitely feel as a working mum, particularly when my kids were really quite young, that I didn't always strike the right balance. But I don't think it was something that you could feel that you could come into the office and say, I'm going to have to put my family first. So I really hope that is something that is starting to change the dial for younger women, and not just those who choose to have children, whatever commitment it is or work-life balance it is that you want to take. So yes, nothing really beats that mum guilt, though. It kind of clicks on from day one, doesn't it?
I think my other reflection would probably be, I could be working until I'm 65 or maybe 70. And I think I put a lot of pressure on myself through university and first career and, wanting to move very quickly through my career. I think what I've reflected on is my career has been a mix of different choices. And because we're working so much longer, I wish I could retire at 50. I don't think I can. But,
Yeah.
it just means that taking the time to say it's okay to make a few career risks and maybe some missteps along the way and experiment a little bit. I have learned and I've gained from that. There's probably some times I thought, oh gosh, moved from Melbourne to Sydney and I'm actually a small town girl of a town of 2,000 people. But I look back and I think, gosh, don't put so much pressure on yourself to elevate so quickly or move so quickly. Take some time to experiment, learn, grow. Take some sideways moves if you want to move into a whole different career or industry. And that's been probably a reflection as well. I think it's playing that long game.
So this year's International Women's Day campaign is Accelerate Action. I suppose that's speaking to what practical actions we can do, whether it be as individuals, businesses, or the wider profession. And I put CIPS at that as well, kind of what we can do as a professional body to drive change. What I guess would you be doing as an individual? What would your pledge or action be? Thinking of International Women's Day and the Accelerate Action theme.
I think continuing to find, mentor diverse talent across, certainly my current business. I think that's a way I can make a small everyday impact. And I spoke about the fact that we can't continue to steal other people's talent. We have to also invest and grow our own. I think that's very important to me. So making sure that we are investing in the future talent, right from former graduates coming off graduate programs. And I'm very hugely invested in looking at we have different level of calibration and talent plans, but I'm also super interested in the people coming off the graduate programs and making sure we retain that talent, because it's in most companies it tend to be 50-50 in many roles, particularly in gender. So it's about not losing that talent, retaining that talent, and making sure that, for me personally, I invest in, I mentor at any one point 3 or 4 people that have diverse backgrounds. Also, they're not all from the UK, they're in different parts of the world. I've in my previous business also, I'd mentored people in Bangalore or different things. So I think I also make myself available, Emma, to women that at any one point want career advice. By all means, I'm not perfect. And people can take my advice with a grain of salt, but I do feel actually very flattered when people ask for, love to get your advice. And I still get calls from people that I probably worked with over 20 years ago, just for, hey, I'm thinking about changing career. Hey, I'm not quite sure about how to approach this situation. So I think making yourself available to diverse talent within your organisation through mentoring and coaching, but also, continuing to support others outside of your organisation in their own career journeys.
Thinking more broadly, I guess, what do you think is procurement's biggest challenge over the next 12 months? What could derail us and deprioritise some of this ED&I work that we perhaps did have as a priority?
There's challenging market conditions. I think there's still tremendous opportunity. Procurement perform their best in looking at different types of value and supporting the business in challenging times. For things like diversity and inclusion and different types of ESG priorities, I think, procurement will still plays a massive role in actually supporting those. But I think, for me, it's just keeping an eye on the different changes coming out of the US, what that means for your sector, industry, and clients that impact your business.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. I think being able to show agility at the moment will be more important than ever, because I kind of think you can plan for whatever might come across in terms of changes, but your ability to pivot and be agile will be really key to success, I think.
I think it's a really good way to put it, Emma. I think agility, resilience, and certainly one of the other pieces of advice I'd have is that it's really important as a leader to recognise when there are pivots and shifts, and perhaps the priorities of the company changes, or the mood music, or the leadership changes. So I think as a procurement leader, pivoting, I think where you see times where people maybe don't land well after a few years is that they have not necessarily learned to pivot when there's been a fundamental shift. And gosh, those pivots keep happening.
Yeah, absolutely. Lauren, I've really enjoyed getting to know you over the past 12 months, and thanks ever so much for joining us on the podcast today. I've loved chatting to you. And a big thanks in advance for joining us on the judging panel for the awards this year. So I'll be looking forward to working with you on that as well.
I'm really excited and inspired about some of the fantastic stories and case studies and submissions to the CIPS awards this year. So very honoured to be part of it, and really looking forward to reading and learning. Also, begging with pride and learning from others is something that I've built my career on. So, Emma, looking forward to hearing from the best of the best. And, in my experience of these awards, you always get fantastic contenders, and it's going to be some really tough decisions, I'd imagine.
Yeah, can't wait. Look forward to it. Thanks, Lauren. It's been really great chatting to you today.
Thank you.
Brilliant to have Lauren Feery on here, and great to have her as one of our judges on the awards this year too. On that point, award entries are now open for many of our regions, including Australia and New Zealand, Middle East, North Africa, as well as our global awards. So do get your entries in and tell us about the brilliant and inspiring work you and your team are doing. Speaking of inspiring, let's move on to our second guest, shall we? As well as sitting on the board of global trustees for CIPS, Juliet Sotnick has held several senior roles in procurement and now wears various hats, including as non-executive director, business advisor, and executive coach. Welcome, Juliet. Great to have you on the podcast. I've obviously known you for years, so really lovely having you on. Nice to see you.
Oh, that's super, Emma. Thank you so much for inviting me to join you today.
No, fabulous. Do you want to just start by introducing yourself? Obviously, I know you well, but for our guests, and give a snapshot of your career to date.
Absolutely. Well, as you've said, I'm now an executive coach and I'm working closely with both procurement and professionals in other functions. I sit on the board of CIPS and I'm also a non-executive director on the board of Nuclear Waste Services. My career has really had a focus on procurement and supply chain and more recently sustainability. I started working out in the Middle East and I was managing events for a while before moving into venture capital. And then I moved to the States, went to business school and worked at PricewaterhouseCoopers in their management consulting group. And I ultimately found a role in procurement when one of the global investment banks was looking to set up a new strategic procurement team to assess internal and external costs. So my introduction to procurement was slightly different than a typical route into the function. After 8 years working in financial services, I made a move into broadcast media and I joined Sky. And then after that, I became Chief Procurement and Supply Chain Officer at Babcock International, which was a FTSE 100 engineering services company. And it had a focus on defence, aviation and civil nuclear. I subsequently became their first Chief Sustainability Officer. And then in 2020, I consolidated both procurement and sustainability experience to work for a telecommunications infrastructure company that focused on emerging markets. So while I've been coaching for a number of years, I finally moved into full-time executive coaching about 18 months ago.
In your role as executive coach now, I understand you work with lots of aspiring female leaders. What are the biggest challenges or obstacles they face in taking their next career steps? Are there any common threads?
Many of the challenges are the same as any other aspiring leader, such as how to effectively engage with key stakeholders, how to develop and implement an aspirational yet achievable strategy, and how to best address specific business or people challenges. There are, however, some conversations that I tend to have more often with aspiring female leaders, and these include an integral challenge which remains unfortunately the same as it has for years, which is how to balance work opportunities with home responsibilities, and especially when significant travel's involved. Secondly, there's the challenge is how do women leaders differentiate themselves from their peers in order to attain a promotion, and then how to manage those ex-peers once they've got that promotion. And one item that comes up frequently from women in coaching conversations is that they find themselves often operating in, and I'm using quotation marks here, people-pleasing mode.
Are there challenges that are unique to different regions or geographies?
Absolutely. And I work with people from all continents. And while many of the challenges are the same, there are a few discussions that tend to come up time and again within a particular geography or region. And these often relate to local cultural or societal norms. And they're often a challenge when the person that I'm coaching is working in a global organization where they have to understand and navigate different styles of communication. So as an example, I have a few clients tell me that it's not the done thing culturally for a woman to challenge a man, regardless of their seniority. And so in those cases, we may spend time working on communication approaches that my client's comfortable with in order for her to make her point effectively within that environment. Another common challenge in some regions is how women can take on new roles that require longer hours or extensive travel. And many countries, networking still happens after work hours, which can also be a challenge for women, and especially when there are cultural norms is that the woman who has primary responsibility in the home and family and is expected to come home directly from work.
Great, thanks. Imposter syndrome, something that comes a lot when we talk about moving into leadership or executive roles. And I've heard experiences from men and women on this one, but today obviously we're talking about women. In your experience, is this something that impacts those you coach?
Absolutely. And I'd like to start my answer to your question with a quote, actually. I had enormous self-image problems and very low self-esteem, which I hid behind obsessive writing and performance. And so that, strangely enough, comes from David Bowie. And he's just someone that we wouldn't necessarily expect to be insecure. And he wasn't alone. 70% of senior managers experience imposter syndrome. So the answer to your question is absolutely yes. It definitely impacts people that I coach. And for those of you who may not be aware of imposter syndrome or what it really means, it's really an internal voice whispering, or sometimes shouting, phrases like, you're a fraud, or you're not good enough, or you'll be found out, they shouldn't have promoted or hired you into that role. And the impacts of these voices is to really make us feel paralyzed and stuck and unable to engage with others effectively or to deliver in the way that we're capable of doing. But it also often makes us play small and safe, and it can push people to the brink of exhaustion where they try and reach that peak of success to prove their worth. And people obsess over minute issues, and they avoid speaking up, even when they're the most knowledgeable person on that topic. And one thing that I think women may find very familiar, it often results in apologising unnecessarily, which we do tend to see quite frequently.
Yeah, I think apologising and often imposing blame on yourself as well, I think.
Absolutely.
Well, it's what have I done that's wrong, that's created this situation, for instance. Are there common causes of imposter syndrome that we should be aware of?
So again, I'll preface this with the key point that it does impact 70% of leaders. So it's not something that is strange or abnormal. In fact, the term imposter syndrome is increasingly criticised for several reasons, particularly by psychologists and people in the work environment. Some of the reasons that people dislike this phrase is by labelling it a syndrome, it sounds like it's a personal mental health issue rather than a natural reaction to a challenging situation. And the term imposter syndrome also implies that the problem is within the person, rather than recognising that maybe the bias or exclusion and there are other systemic barriers may be the cause of why people may feel like they don't belong. And this is often the case with women and minorities and also first-generation professionals who feel like imposters, not because they lack the skills, but because workplaces make them feel unwelcomed or undervalued. And the term often ignores the impact of unequal work environments. So many people who feel imposter syndrome, quotation marks, actually suffer from lack of role models in leadership, or there are pay gaps or recognition gaps that reinforce their feelings of not being good enough. So by telling people, and especially women and minorities, to overcome imposter syndrome, it suggests that they need to change themselves, rather than maybe workplace needing to be more inclusive and equitable and supportive. So one of the things I like to do is just to reframe this as imposter feelings rather than a syndrome, because it helps to make the process of addressing this much more manageable.
Yeah, interesting. And it can manifest itself in lots of different ways, yeah?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. So imposter feeling comes in different forms depending on how someone experiences self-doubt. I've got 5 different ways that people might respond to feeling like an imposter in mind. There are many more. So I'll just run through those 5 briefly and give a sense as to what people might be thinking about or feeling and also how this may be addressed. So the first one is the perfectionist. And this is someone who feels like a failure if they don't meet impossibly high standards. And they typically focus on what could have been done better rather than celebrating their achievements. They also struggle with delegating tasks and they fear that others won't meet their own high standards. So a way of addressing this is to establish realistic goals and celebrating small wins. The second one is the superhero. So this is somebody who feels the need to work harder than everyone else to prove their worth. And they often overwork and ultimately struggle with burnout. And they typically measure their own self-worth through productivity and external validation. So one thing to recognise is that no one would expect an Olympic champion to run races at the same pace day in, day out. Everybody needs to pause and introduce balance into their lives. And that's one of the things that's really important to look at is where is the balance and have you established that properly to help you deliver effectively at work. The third one is the natural genius. So somebody who believes that competence should come easily and naturally, and when it doesn't, they feel like a fraud. And then they avoid challenges when they may not immediately excel at them. So a way to address this is really to focus the value on the journey and not just the accomplishment of what they're trying to get to. The fourth one is the soloist. And this is someone who believes that they must do everything alone and they refuse to ask for help. And they usually believe that asking for support is a sign of weakness or failure. And that means that they often struggle with teamwork and collaboration. So the conversations that we typically have around that is to reframe collaboration and to really understand what it could look like and how it can be a strength, not a weakness. And then the final example is the expert. And this is somebody who feels like a fraud unless they know everything about a subject. They often avoid speaking up or taking opportunities due to their fear of not knowing enough. And sometimes this is shown in a way of looking at new qualifications, pursuing new qualifications or training to prove their competence. So again, in conversations about this, we often talk about learning as growth, not as a weakness, so that it helps people really feel that confidence in their capabilities and looking at the growth opportunity as something completely separate.
I recognise myself in a few of those things that you described there, Juliet. So I guess it's not that you fit into one camp. You could possibly feel multiple variations of the things that you just described there.
Oh, absolutely. And these things pop up at different times, given different situations that individuals feel themselves in. So there's no one size for one person. It's a natural response to an environment that you're in at a given time. And that response may differ depending on who you're with or how many times you've been in that scenario before.
Yeah, and I guess it can change from different things you're doing within your job or different people that you're dealing with within your job.
Absolutely.
or even your home life as well, I guess.
Yes.
And how can you address imposter syndrome? What advice would you give for those who experienced it and would really like to be more observant of their behaviours and try and overcome them?
Professional lives change when you realise that good things happen when you put yourself into rooms and situations where you don't feel like you belong. That's where growth happens. So everyone feels discomfort when they start pushing into new activities or responsibilities. And the one thing that I think is really important to recognise is that self-doubt does not mean incompetence. So there are a few ways that your company, so whether that's your manager or HR, can provide support. But I'll just outline a few ways that you can also directly address your feelings. So the first one is to really note what you're spending your time focusing on. There are only some things that we can control or influence ourselves. And so the best use of our energy is to focus on those activities, not what other people are doing. The second one is to realise that no one knows everything and everyone has a blind spot or weaknesses. And the key thing is to really be aware of what your weaknesses are and not to allow them to undermine your self-worth. The third thing is the flip side. It's not the weaknesses, but it's your successes. So it's about believing in yourself. And tennis player Serena Williams' coach once said, to be able to want something, you must first believe in it. Then add some hard work and everything becomes possible. So success breeds confidence and confidence needs practice. So one way of addressing this is to record your successes. Just write a list of them, big and small, along with some of your skills and the personal qualities you've used, and identify what you learnt on the way. And once you put those down in writing, it becomes much easier to then practice that and use them again and again before they become second nature. The fourth point is to remember you don't have to have all the answers, and the best leaders don't know everything. But what they are willing to do is to collaborate through uncertainties. So be a learner rather than a knower, and that will take you a long way. And then reframe your perspective. And as I said, so much of this is about doing things for the first time or stepping into an environment that is new or unknown. And there's a flip side to fear, which is excitement. So by looking at things as an opportunity, an example being networking meetings, I always used to find these terrifying, walking into a room of people that I didn't know. But actually, once you realise that the vast majority of people in those rooms also don't know other people, and they are also just as nervous, it really helps release that fear, and then you can turn that into an opportunity to get to know new people.
One final question I have for you then. What's the one piece of practical advice you'd have given your younger self?
So it's interesting because as I now operate as a coach, looking back on this, my advice to my younger self is actually to go out and find a coach, even before you become a head of or a CPO. I had mentors in my earlier career, and they were really useful in navigating ins and outs of the companies I was working in. But it wasn't until I stepped up to become a CPO and the company I worked for then gave me a coach that I realized what the difference between a mentor and a coach was. And while a mentor shares their personal experience and knowledge of a function or a company with you, which can be absolutely invaluable, a coach operates as a partner. So coaching really provides an opportunity to me where I could open my eyes to the art of the possible. And it was a safe space for me to be vulnerable and to explore scenarios and to learn how I could better apply my strengths and compensate for my weaknesses. So on reflection, it really would have been useful for me to have had a coach earlier on in my career.
Absolutely. Great advice. Thanks ever so much, Juliet, for joining us and sharing your insights with us. Really, really appreciate it.
Oh, my pleasure, Emma. Thank you so much for having me.
So that's it for this special episode of Futures celebrating International Women's Day. Thanks both to our wonderful guests, and we'll be back again next month. Don't forget to follow, rate and review the podcast if you've enjoyed this episode. And if you're a regular listener, please do share with your colleagues, teams and network. This podcast has been brought to you by CIPS, the Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply. For more information on CIPS, head over to cips.org, where you can find out about our up-and-coming events and the excellent training opportunities on offer. For now, though, that's it from us. See you next time.